So, like I said, Jay Manning, Cloud Reach. I'm North American Partnership Lead. So I'll tell you, I am the AWS Partnership Lead, but this is not going to be leading towards them or any specific vendor. This is just kind of in general things to kind of watch out for, and just making sure that you're practicing some best practices and ways of making it easy. All right. So the first thing you really want to do, and before there is the process of building a migration framework, but before you do anything, step one is engaging the right people. And that kind of goes without saying, but really needs to be said, because having the right people involved in the very beginning of any migration project is instrumental to success. Because a lot of times you'll find halfway through a migration, when you're 2, 3 steps in, you're going to see a technical gap or a learning gap, and then you're going to have a pause and you're going to have a stalled migration, which is the thing that nobody wants, ends up wasting everybody's time. So with with these high velocity migrations, especially with the healthcare industry and things along those lines, this becomes paramount to have the right people that will ultimately form what's called your migration brain trust or cloud center of excellence, which is going to be your people that you're going to be bouncing off of different things. And that's really, in reality, is going to really shape the overall theme of your migration. But getting into the technical things, you're really going to need to build a framework that's going to really have a governing outline of principles of how the migration should be delivered, and also a guidance of establishing a way that that's going to look like. And that predefined architecture design principles are going to say, hey, we're going to work on AWS, we're going to work through Google or Azure, we're going to work on the Python, we're going to work on specific languages, specific ways, that everything is really unified. Because what happens is, a lot of times, is having lots of program management can present a real complication when you have a lot of different people working on it. Like, this becomes really important when you have multiple applications. Let's say you have 300 applications and they're being run on multiple different project management applications with multiple different teams. That is just as bad as a stalled migration, because then you're wasting engineering time of having developers moving forward with things that someone else could be doing. And something as simple as a misspelled server name, could cause a formula to be removed from the entire migration space. So, and also having, of course, clearly defined thresholds in line with the cost model. Because a lot of times when while we always talk about cost being important, a lot of times the ideal cost of what the development team can do and what your CTO and your leadership team and what they're willing to pay for are going to be two different things. So before you get too far down the line, definitely establish a cost model. And also, what you really want to do is you want to have clearly defined directives and expectations. And what that really means is having more so of I would say an understanding and respect for the processes of each team, and understanding that what your CEO can do, what your CTO can't do, and just understanding like what your dev team can do and what all of those limitations are, and then understanding what those primary results are going to be and what the results of what you're trying to achieve in the cloud is overall. Because a lot of times people will say, hey, I want to move to the cloud, we want to migrate, we want to do this, but you have to really step back and say why. And kind of as we touched on before, is it because you want to change patient billing? Is it because you want to run a specific application that you need to get to market faster, because you want your dev team to be more agile? You really have to have all of those expectations in line with your cloud center of excellence. And that really is going to come down with coming and managing those expectations. And also, you want to have establish a review framework, which is going to also have parameters with your engineering teams and your development teams and your actual technical reviews to align these actual solutions. Because a lot of times, yes, everyone will talk about cloud migration coming from the top down and leadership, and everyone has to have buy-in. All that's great, but it really comes down to the engineering teams and the design teams being able to make the technical product work together. So really having these regular architecture review sessions, whether it's after a certain sprint or after a certain workflow, you really want to have an approval process in place for making sure that things move along. And if you can automate it, even better. It's something where you really want to make sure that you want to have guardrails, not stop signs, when you're doing your migration, because you really want to give your dev team the ability to be agile. That's the entire point of migrating to the cloud. So, And to follow with that, it's all across the board, communication consistency is key, because the last thing you want to do is wasting engineer time. I mean, you really want to make sure that you are figuring out the exact needs of the project. You're also figuring out that the different scopes that are going to fall under the different categories of different things within your cloud center of excellence. And you're also going to differentiate different softwares and different responses, different real-time things where you're going to be doing all of these things. So you really want to make sure that all of this is consistent on a level, not just a spoken communication, but also from a technical communication and from a workload communication standpoint too. Again, it always comes back to prioritizing clear accountability. And so any changes that happen within the migration, or any changes that happen within your development plan, that needs to be communicated through those appropriate channels. And it really has to be done through that commitment to a more agile environment overall with the cloud. As I mentioned earlier, that's a key part of any application or assessment, whether it be automated, like we talked about, or if you're manually doing it, is mapping out the dependencies of each particular application. It's dependencies can vary widely from, file sharing to storage to remote different things to different packages and third-party software. So it's a lot of things that each type is going to require a different tactical approach during a migration. So, and one of the other things I really wanted to touch on too is when you're doing a migration, a lot of times, one of the largest limitations is going to be licensing from different legacy software, legacy applications. And so licensing is like deaths and taxes. It's like something we all have to deal with. It's in a high velocity migration though, it's critical to make sure that the licensing loose ends are all tied up. If not, there's eventually it's going to come back to bite you in the ass, where you're going to come and say, hey, we've got everything working, but we're tied to this other license. It doesn't expire till God knows when, another 18 months or something. So then you're stalled on that, or you're stalled on trying to find a workaround. So you really want to review the current arrangements that you have to confirm that they're all a fit for migration with the appropriate cloud providers that you already have installed with the different things. So like, let's say you're on Oracle and you're moving to Amazon, make sure you know what's going on with your Oracle licensing. Like, make sure those things are really buttoned up. And if you have one, a lot of teams do. Some people have a licensing specialist that sometimes is in your procurement department that'll say, hey, this is what we really have going on. They might be not up to date, but it's going to be better than nothing, where you're going to go finding in the dark. At least it gives you somewhat of a flashlight. So. And yeah, that's kind of the gist of it there. I sent this over to Nick, so he'll be able to send this out to everybody after. And yeah, there's my LinkedIn, my email, and any questions. So.
Yeah, I had a question, Jay. You mentioned I think it was the Cloud Center of Excellence. Mm-hmm. Could you go more into like what that is and how you would set it up?
Yeah. So what happens is, with your Cloud Center of Excellence, it's generally going to be your, maybe depending on how big your team is and depending how many stakeholders are involved, are going to be your key stakeholders that are involved in the migration from a payment standpoint, from an implementation standpoint, from a training standpoint, from a licensing and agreement standpoint. So that could be maybe 5 or 6 people. It could be 2 people. It could be maybe, more 12 people to 18 people. As Nick knows, in Amazon, we say a thing called 2 pizza teams, which is about 12 to 18 people. So generally, that's the largest size you want for a Cloud Center of Excellence, but because then you start to see that the ability to be agile kind of get marred in that. But in reality, it's going to be your key people that are working on the migration and that are going to be directing generally your cloud environment and your cloud provider relationships.
Okay, so it's like just the core team that's planning the migration and kind of the support work of how people are going to know what to do. So just another kind of thought I had is like what is the planning phase versus the execution phase for these kind of things? Like, what are you seeing in that, or what do you recommend, I guess, in that area?
I find a lot that the planning phase is probably a lot longer than the execution phase. And the execution phase really depends on basically who's going to be on that dev team and who's really implementing it, and from a training standpoint. Because a lot of times what I'll find is someone will be trained, or what I'll find with teams is they'll have a whole team that's trained on, say, Azure, or they're trained on legacy applications. The problem is that they have limited training on AWS or GCP, so they have to go learn that, and then that causes the stall from that planning phase. But once if they, a lot of times what companies, I'll see companies do is engage a pro serve, or they'll engage a limited DevOps engagement for the gaps that they don't have. So depending on how fast they want to get done, they will either take their time, do it depending on how critical it is. But when it's critical, they're going to buy in that execution phase.
Actually, Jay, a lot of what you said here was very true. Like, as someone who tried to migrate like an entire like infrastructure from GCP to AWS, like my boss wanted me to do that, and I was the only guy on the team. His planning was very poor, and so as a result, we went back and forth. We had to like argue about like how many Docker containers we had to create, like which applications we wanted to create with them, and like in the end, we just scrapped the entire idea. So it was very disorganized, and I understand that the planning phase is so important, and I wish more people would emphasize it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that happens, where you really have a disconnect where people will say, "Oh yeah, let's just move this. It's so easy," and and to be honest, AWS and GCP and Azure, they make it sound easy. They will tell you how easy it is until you sign the contract, and then they're like, "Hey, where'd you guys go?" And it's like, "Oh, here's a list of partners that might be able to help you." And so then people try to do it on their own, and then they, a cloud center of excellence shouldn't be one person, obviously, to be, have to do that. So. But yeah, it really is key with that planning and having that and knowing what your roadmap looks like, because a lot of times people will go through and say, "Hey, we want to migrate to the cloud," but once we get there, we don't know how we're going to manage this or what we're going to do with it. We're just going to spend money for it. We have the resources, but we just don't have the people or infrastructure to manage it. So you have these unused, basically cloud contracts or things where they're just like, "Yeah, we're in the cloud, but we're not really using it." So.
I wanted to bring up another thing, which is a common complaint I've had, seen a couple in different ways, is like, "Oh, we moved to the cloud or whatever, but now it's super expensive. We weren't expecting it to cost this much." So like, how do you deal with that with some of these customer contracts or whatever? And they're like, "Oh, we're starting to migrate now. It looks like the costs are 30% more or 40% more than we were expecting or whatever."
Yeah, well, see, that's where optimization comes in. And so basically it's the theory that once everybody migrates to the cloud, and for lack of a better term, the cloud providers have to sell them something else. And so basically it becomes a competition between each one to say, "Hey, well, you're running this in AWS, but let's say if we cut this, and this, we can put you in here." And then they resell the idea of moving them to a different service. So let's say, for example, they were using a lot of, I'm just going to use AWS just for sake. Let's say they had a lot of stuff in S3, and then for some reason they aren't running as many static websites and they're not really using it as much, but it's still something that's just sitting on their infrastructure. There are actually programs and companies, and we're one of them, that will actually go in and literally look at every little scrap of that infrastructure to see how many pennies they can save. So that way they can reroute those pennies to another service that they aren't using yet, to then start the process all over again. So in reality, that's where you have these companies where they kind of, not necessarily a race to the bottom, it's a race to the bottom in certain areas and then moving over. But what happens is companies are not stupid now, especially enterprise ones. They're learning to have a little bit of infrastructure in all three cloud providers, and sometimes four. So that way they can leverage and say, "Hey, if you don't give me the thing that I need, then I'm going to go to GCP, or I'm going to go to Azure, or I'm going to go to AWS." And in response, the cloud providers will say, "Well, then we'll try what's called an enterprise discount program." So even though AWS is pay as you go as a service, as a large company, you can commit to spending, like, let's say you're like, "I'll commit to spending $10 million over the next 5 years or something, or 3 years." AWS can break up that services however they want. They can make it pro serve, they can make it anything. They put pro service and professional services. They can do that, but the company is committed to spending $10 million no matter what. And so that's where they're able to do that. But rather than saying a consumption model of just saying that, it's like, "No, we can make it unlimited, or we can make it nothing, or we'll figure out a way, but you're just going to give it, no matter what, you're going to give us $10 million. So.
And is that part of like, when do you recommend starting the conversation about doing like enterprise rates or whatever, like negotiating lower rates for these guys? Because I know you can get reserved instances, but I'm pretty sure you can also go lower through actual negotiations and stuff.
Yes, and so reserved instances are actually, or have been, or being retired for something in exchange called savings plans. And savings plans kind of, as we touched on, are more in line with that. We're going to spend more money. And so I would involve that as early in the process that you know that you're going to be moving all or most of your infrastructure to one cloud provider. If you're going to be cloud agnostic and kind of have like a 30-30-30 model, or 30% and then 10% on infrastructure and or on-prem, then sure, you can avoid the discount program. But if you're going to go all in, or if you're digital native, 100%, if you're digital native, I would have that conversation like immediately, almost like, and just say, hey, we need to get there, and they'll put the whole guns behind it, because then you're going to qualify for different discount programs. And a lot of times they're going to have different customer cash incentives that are going to allow you to make the migration profitable. They want you to be, so this is the thing, the cloud providers want you to be successful, and they want you to be successful on their cloud. So that way they can then have customer case studies and make sure that you never leave. Because you have to figure that there was one time Uber started in AWS. Uber can never leave AWS now. Like, they just can't ever do it. Like, so it's like they could say they're going to go to GCP, but there's no way they could do it. But now they get a giant discount. So it's a win-win for everybody in that sense.
And just follow on that, like, who are the contact points that you usually, because most of us are like from the dev side, so we aren't really working with the sales team. Like, who are the points of contacts, and like what kind of level is that kind of conversation happening at?
In what sense are you looking, as far as if you were looking to begin a migration with a partner or a cloud provider, or if you were looking to get more, I guess, technical side of what a migration might look like?
I'm talking more about like particularly on the discounts in the context of like, we built this on AWS, now we've already migrated or whatever, but now we're having a lot of pressure to get our costs down or something. Like, who's the contact points at AWS we want to be hitting up?
Yeah, so if you have any infrastructure whatsoever, whether it be $1 in AWS, you have an account manager. So anytime you spend more than $1, there's someone specifically dedicated to your account. You can reach out to them. They will make sure that you are in touch with whoever you need to be, whether that means technical training or that means sales. They'll make sure you grow from there. If you're looking to go to something where you're like, I want to figure out which cloud provider, and I don't know if I want to go AWS, GCP, or Google, I would reach out to a partner or a premier partner like a Slalom, a Splunk, or someone, or a Deloitte, or someone that does all three. And they're going to give you an overall infrastructure map and say, hey, this is what the three are going to cost. This is what you want to do. This is how you should do it. Or this is where you're going to save money, or here you're going to leave. And then they can also help you get in touch with someone you want, because they also get discounts as well. So each partnership level has different discounts depending on the cloud provider. Each website has a list, or each cloud provider has a website with a list of all of their premier partners, and the premier partners will then tell you which discounts they qualify for. I'm not saying that just because I'm on the partnership side. I would say that if you are on the fence of which company you want to go with, unless you have a directive of saying, hey, we're already going with AWS, or we're going with GCP, or we've got Microsoft licensing, I would highly recommend at least talking to a partner and seeing how the infrastructure can run in multiple cloud providers, from both a development standpoint and a cost standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions, guys?
I have a question. It's more so about the cloud services market itself.
Yeah.
I know that either Google or it was either Google or Microsoft. One of them said that they want to capture a big share of the cloud services market. Do you think that's going to happen, or no?
Yeah, it's happening. So it's happening. So about 2 years ago, AWS had a 57% market share I think they're down to 42 this year, and Google's making the largest rise. And the headline will always say AWS has the largest market share, but it's starting to dwindle down. The reason that is because AWS is really built on AWS enterprise companies and services billing is really built on 4 main services, which is S3, RDS, Redshift, and then Dynamo. So you have really 4 key things that are in the cloud. The cloud has moved on to a lot of things, containerization, Kubernetes, and that is one of GCP that is actually created by GCP. So they actually have a little bit more advantage of that, and companies that are doing that are seeing that they can move infrastructure from there. The other thing Google does that puts them, I will say, I won't say above because they're still number 3. Don't get me wrong, they're still in third place. But the thing that they're doing that's really helping them rise is when they're going into conversations with these enterprise customers, they're doing something different than AWS and Microsoft. AWS and pretends that Microsoft and Google don't exist. Can't be done, can't even talk about it. Microsoft has never heard of AWS or Google. Google not only has heard of those, but they're like, no, you can run this infrastructure in our environment and it's fine. Like you can run BigQuery and you can run Anthos and you can run all this stuff. And they like you being multi-cloud because they know if they get a little bit of the chunk, it'll start to expand and start to expand and start to expand. And so that's a land and expand model for all 3. For Google, it's a land and expand. For Microsoft, it's hang on to whatever they got left. And Amazon, it's like, hey, you're already here. Where else are you going to go? So I like the Google model better.
Yeah, definitely more customer friendly.
Right. Now that said, like my main partnership role is with AWS, and AWS it's not going anywhere anytime soon. They will always innovate something. There's going to be something that they think of that the other 2 did not, and that's going to be the thing that customers are happy about. And the thing you can never underestimate about customers is how much they want to be like other customers. So AWS does this thing every year where they will take their biggest customer and they will take whatever their biggest accomplishment is, put the CEO on their live stage with a big thing and say, hey, look at this great thing we did to revolutionize the industry and did this. You can be just like us. And then all these companies fall over themselves to try. These CEOs fall over themselves to be like, hey, can I just get a little bit of taste of what